Hi, and welcome to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro, and I have as my guest tonight Jen Latimer. Jen is the children's librarian, or actually the elementary school librarian at Clinton School. And so we want to talk a little bit about school librarians and about the importance of the role that the librarians play in the children's educational experience. And as for me, I'm also particularly interested in how you evaluate the books and so forth that kids will read and how they're recommended. So, Jen, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
And maybe before we get started, maybe just a little background on yourself. What got you interested in being a librarian?
So I'm a lifelong library user. I was raised by a mother who believed when it was a good day, you go to the library. When it's a bad day, you go to the library. When you are bored, you go to the library. And so we went to the library regularly, and it was a place where literally I had my first sense of freedom. So we would get to the library, and I have this very strong memory of my mom sort of like wandering away a little bit. She probably knew everywhere we were, and she would let us explore the children's department, right, the children's area. Pick out whatever books we wanted, she would check them out for us, and we would go home. And as I got older, I was able to go to the library by myself on my bike. Again, check out anything I could possibly want, and then I was responsible for getting them back. And as an adult, I went to school, I got a degree, I went to work for Ford Motor Company, and a decade later I stopped working for them, had a child, and then got that really great opportunity that not everybody gets, was to reinvent themselves. And I said, what makes me happy? And our librarian at Clinton left. I say our because my son was at Clinton School at that point, and they had a substitute in there. I said, if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. And they said, well, let me get back to you. And then it was, do you want to be a substitute teacher? Do you want to get your library degree? And the rest is history. I never had to give up the job, and I've been there for now 12 years.
Great. Well, it brings up two questions. One, kind of a straightforward question, is the role of a school librarian as opposed to the role of a public librarian, and whether or not the training and the education is any different. I'd be curious to know about that. But you said something that really struck a chord. You're looking at the library in the way of kind of a freeing experience, a sense of freedom, and do kids tend to see it that way? It's a really sort of interesting concept. Is that their first opportunity to show some independence?
I know when kids come to the library at Clinton, now it is a school library, so I teach every student at the school. So everybody comes to library, it's a class, but I see children every day skip gleefully into library. So it is a place of comfort, it is a place of joy and choice. And so in a school experience, it is a tremendously powerful place to be, because you realize that when I am not at school, it is like the world has ended for some children. Like, how dare you take a day off? How dare you have a meeting to go to or get sick? So I try very hard not to miss school for really any reason. But the public library, it still is. I go to our public library here in Maplewood often. The kids joke, I sometimes leave work and then I go to the public library. So I go from library to library. And sometimes I stop at Words as well, so then there's more books. But it is a place that's really nice to see a little bit of split from your family, right? Like, the children can go off and they can select books, and there's a little bit of agency and control over what they are taking in. And I enjoy that. And I encourage parents to let children explore. They're going to pick books that are not the ones they want. They're going to be disappointed in some. But I don't think you can figure out what you like unless you figure out what you don't like.
No, it's a good point. And your point about going from library to bookstore, it's one of the things about it that I find so fascinating is that the range of subjects. And all of a sudden you're like, there was a book, I just saw a book review a couple of weeks ago. It was something called about the War of Jenkins' Ear.
Okay.
I never heard of that, but apparently this took place before the American Revolution.
It did?
When Britain and Spain were involved in like a worldwide battle over supremacy of the earth or something like that. You know, the kind of stuff that you just don't hear about. You have to, but thank goodness somebody writes about it, So the second question, if I may, was the
Absolutely.
difference in the training or the education or the courses between the public librarian and the roles as well, the difference between the elementary school librarian and the public librarian.
So to be a librarian, you have to have a master's degree. So already, I feel like not everybody realizes that, but there's like a definite path, a very clear line of topics you need to know. Everything from curation of resources to like bookkeeping and there's so much information management. But you can get an MLIS, a Master of Library and Information Systems. The difference when you decide you want to be a school librarian is you have to take an additional, I think it was 9 credits, that pertain to the teaching aspect. So when you're in a town library, and I don't want to pretend to be an expert of what they do every day, I've only seen what they do from people I know, you are very much community facing, right? Adults, everything. So you have that. I'm on a fixed schedule. As I said, every class comes into the library for 50 minutes. And I have to create lesson plans and follow the curriculum, and also really support the classroom curriculum. I like to say the library is something it's like the hub of the building, and it wraps around all subjects. So if a classroom teacher is teaching something, I oftentimes will incorporate a little bit of that into the library lesson, and kids still say, wow, I don't know how you knew that's what we're talking about in class. Like, well, your teachers and I talk often. So it's really exciting. Like, you really can be, you can be pervasive in the whole system, if that's the right term. Like, you can really just make sure your presence is felt everywhere.
Well, you mentioned you had to take 9 additional credits, I
Yes.
guess, that had to do with education.
Correct.
Was that related to teaching, or maybe more related to the how you would interface with kids of certain ages? I mean, because you have K through 5, right?
Right. So I have everyone from the 5-year-olds to about the 11-year-olds. That's the rough age span. No, it was a lot of lesson planning and building all those things in a school that you might need to do, right? The planning of that, the budgeting for a school library, the interactions with the children really is, well, for me, I always feel like it's somewhat instinctual, right? Like, I feel like I'm a natural connector with children, which is not uncommon in education. There are often many of us who feel very natural talking to children. In fact, some people don't feel as comfortable talking to adults, which I always laugh, because they talk for a living, they work with people, but really they like the, in this case, the under 11 crowd or under 12 crowd. I could pretty much talk to anyone. Like, I take after my father, who can, like, he's a used car salesman, so he will talk to anyone, and I will just pick up a conversation with anyone who's willing to listen. But a lot of, I didn't necessarily get that from graduate school. How to connect with kids, how to match them to the perfect book. I took classes on what books that were out there for literature. And I like to tell the children sometimes they'll say, I have homework tonight. I'm like, oh, so do I. They're like, well, what homework could you possibly have? I said, reading books. Every night I read, right? Every morning I read. In between classes I read. And then I have a whole army of readers for me, because I can't possibly read everything. So I always tell the children, like, if you want to read this book, that's great. Can you give me a summary when you get done with it? And then they do. So that's how it helps me, again, match kids to books. So in that respect, it sounds like it's instinctual, as you said, but also I guess you learn on the job. I mean, your instinct and the evidence that you get in terms of reaction, I guess it all works together. So how different are the kids, say the 5 years old to the 11 years old, and how one of the things I wonder about is that you get a book and it'll say a grade level. I don't know how accurate those are. Maybe you have some idea how accurate they are. I mean, I just wonder if the interests, I presume, are different, but I don't know, or maybe the interests are the same. Maybe it's just the complexity of the subject and they're interested in the same thing. What's children,
it like?
Children, first of all, they're all very different and unique. right? There are some broad things you can paint with children, or you can find some commonalities. But for me, one of the most important things I can do is talk to a child one-on-one, right? And so all day long, I'm building these little moments where I can talk to them, and they trust with me their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their interests. To me, that is, that is a very intimate moment we share, right? A very quiet moment where they'll say to me, like, I'm really curious about this, right? And sometimes they literally whisper it to me, like, I've really been wanting to know more about this topic. And a 5-year-old is going to express that differently than maybe an 11-year-old, which is more sophisticated. But stories of friendship they're timeless. I've often said, when I was thinking about this interview, what is the difference between them? Literature, no matter who it was written for, if it's well written, is beautiful. So I enjoy reading a book meant for 5th graders as much as I do a book written for adults. If it is well written and sincere, I get as much joy out of it. And so yes, in kindergarten you get more superheroes, perhaps. You get that. But 5th graders want to read about friendship. They want to read about, but they tend to be more sophisticated. They want to read about problems. I will say there's a very common theme that runs through 4th and 5th grade, especially 5th grade, where they will come to me and say, give me your hardest problem book, your saddest book, your most challenging book. And I was thinking, why do you want to read this all the time? But I really think it's how they work through life, right? Children know what it's like to have divorced parents, or maybe their friends' parents are divorced. They want to read a book about a child who has a disability. They want to read about a child who's bullied. They want to read about a racism, LGBTQ+, because so many of them are either curious or see it in their own life, or don't, and it's just a way for them to just sort of ask questions. It's a really safe environment for them. A book doesn't judge them, right? A book allows them to take what they want out of it. I often say, because sometimes adults will say to me, that book was really serious. I mean, you and I have talked about this. There are certain books that are very serious. And I said, I always tell you, don't presume that children are taking the same thing out of the book that you do, right? You're going to read a book with a certain lens because you've experienced life. Sometimes kids will just read a book and they just see maybe a conflict, but they're not really emotionally attached to it. They want to see how problems are solved, which, don't we all want to see how problems are solved and hopefully solve them proactively and productively? Yeah,
well, you raise a few things I'd like to talk about, but we're going to have to take a break.
Absolutely.
So when we come back, we'll continue. So if you'll stay with us, we'll be back in a minute with Books in Action.
It's an onion.
Hi, and welcome back to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro, and I'm here with Jen Latimer. Jen is the Clinton School librarian, and we've been talking about, as you might have guessed, librarians and books. So one of the last things we talked about, Jen, before the break was the way that kids may see things differently than adults, so that maybe parents then get too concerned about a book that they think might have too serious a theme, and they shouldn't. So maybe you can expand on that a little bit, and then also perhaps we can talk about, is there some kind of point, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, or some kind of point where there's a kind of a major change in interest and ability?
Absolutely. Well, I brought a few books with me, of course. A good librarian always travels with books. And Clinton was really honored to have Kelly Yang come visit us the other day, virtually, from California. And her new book is called New from Here. Now, this book does not mix words, right? It takes place in a time of COVID. She wrote it based loosely on her life and how she was living in Hong Kong. She is an American citizen, and so is her husband, but her children were born in Hong Kong. And then COVID hits. And they think, where can we go that's safe? We don't want to be in Hong Kong. So they come to America. The children insert the children's laughter, because when we're talking about this, they're like, oh, and of course it came here. Adults sometimes think, I don't want to talk about COVID. I want to be moved beyond this. Children are completely interested in reading this book, enthralled by this book. She touches upon racism that has happened, anti-Chinese attitudes, and the children, while they might not understand it at the level an adult is going to understand, this is their life. And I have to remind myself, if you're 10 years old, and for the last 2 years, call it, if your life has been like, this has been it, that is like a fifth of your life. And a lot of it that you remember, right? Because you're not going to remember 1 and 2 potentially. So, like I always think, we might not want to read about it, but children relate, are interested by, and want to know what it was like for other children. So things like Kelly Yang, I'm very appreciative that she takes the time to write these hard-hitting books because kids love it. You know, Kwame Alexander is another one. He really connects with children. His books are written in poetry form. He's been into our school, and I, hesitant reader, I give them Kwame Alexander, done, hooked. You know, my job is done. I look like a hero. And, you know, he connects with them with basketball and this movement. The reading style is all, like, very fluid. And then going to your other question about, like, what age sort of there's this shift. For me, I have convinced it is the second grade. So kindergarten, first grade, I can pretty much guarantee what the kids are going to ask me, the books they want to read. And then something happens in second grade, and it's, like, developmental, the questions they ask. And I brought something that a recent lesson that we just did, which I had written the arc one way and it completely changed. So I shared for Black History Month a book about Horace Pippin called A Splash of Red. Now Horace Pippin was a painter from Westchester. He happened to strangely have the same birthday as George Washington, and he was in World War I and he was injured. He was shot in the arm. The book doesn't go into great detail, but it just mentions that he had this injury from the war, and he couldn't paint after that until he decided or figured out that if he could use his left hand to move his right hand, he could go back and paint. But then nobody bought his paintings. He was then discovered and ultimately painted everyday objects with a splash of red. And then the children and I went and we realized in the back of the end papers, all the museums now around the country, that you can see Horace Pippin's everyday portraits, everyday work with the splash of red. So I read this book. The children are fascinated by this injury, right? They kept really wanting to think about this whole, what would you do if you didn't have the use of your arm anymore? In fact, I got an email the other day. A child was at the Met this past weekend. They saw a Horace Pippin. He was completely enthralled by the fact that he saw this Horace Pippin, this painting. That led us to read about the Paralympics. I had happened to buy some books about the Paralympics. I said, kids, the Olympics just ended. Now we're going to have the Paralympics. What is that? We are now in part of library. We've watched some of the replays of the events. They want to know about prosthetic legs, how technology has changed. These are second graders, right? I never would have predicted the conversation would go this way. We had another book written by somebody who is in a wheelchair, and Shane Burkow talks about, like, how do you talk about a disability? And so children are like, well, what do you do if you see somebody who has something? Oh, not all disabilities you can see. What do you do then? And this evolution, what happens in second grade, like, they are so curious that you basically want to, as a teacher, you want to scrap your plans and you want to follow their curiosity, right? Yeah. And you want to see it, and then you realize there's an end. And now you can go back to what else you had wanted to talk about. But to me, it's second grade that happens. Like, Mrs. Latimer, we want to know more. Where can we find more information? Where could you go on the internet? Where could we look on all of our resource, our places we have to research in that are school appropriate? So it's second grade. It's the brains, something that is firing, their curiosity, their ability to vocalize things. Really, for me, I find it's that. And then again in fifth grade they're just about to go to middle school, and fifth graders will ask you questions like, Mrs. Latimer, what do you think about systemic racism? I That's a great question. I've never thought how I would answer that to a 10-year-old, right? I'm a huge reader of information, like books on this topic. How do I feel about this? How do I become a better person? How to become a better teacher? But again, the language I might use with a grown-up peer is not the language I might use with a 10-year-old. Or Mrs. Latimer, I would like, I'm curious about, again, and you can insert anything you never thought you'd be asked. And that happens in 5th grade, right? They just have this insatiable curiosity for the toughest topics. And they'll ask you at the moment you absolutely do not think they're going to ask you.
Yeah, I think curiosity.
It's hard
is
to
important.
prepare for
Yeah,
them.
no, and that's part of the challenge, I guess. But you bring up two things I was thinking about as you were talking. One is you used, I don't know if you used the word, but I think what you meant is vocabulary. Do you think that a change in vocabulary may be part of the reason that 2nd graders and 5th graders have these kind of demarcations and these changes because they have more words to talk about?
Absolutely. I think they have language so they can put a question to it. But I also think there must be something fascinatingly happening in their brain. Like they're also their emotional intelligence. I think there's some of that. Also in their curriculum, their regular learning, like the topics that they're naturally covering. 5th graders talking about the founding documents. Opens the door to so much interesting conversation, right? How was this country founded, right? All men are created equal. And then you'll get that kid in the room, really? Or the girl who says, what about me?
Yeah.
And that is partly brought up because they are learning about these things through history. And then they're in a safe place, right? There is no question that is not allowed in the library. If you have a question, I'll try to have an answer, and I'm very open that I might not always have an answer, but I will most likely or most definitely work to find an answer for them.
I think
so.
The experience I've had, I think kids appreciate that. I think they appreciate honesty like that, and the point of children. Do you think we tend to underestimate them? I had I knew someone who served on the Board of Education years ago, and she thought that older children's books were better than children's books at that time, and this was maybe 20 years ago, and whether it's still true now, I don't know, because the older children's books seemed to deal with some of the topics you're talking about, harder things, deaths of siblings, war. It didn't try to sugarcoat that, whereas she felt that at that point in time, at any rate, 20 years ago, let's say, that books tried to avoid that for kids. And I wonder, do you think we underestimate kids in their ability to handle that kind of thing?
I'm glad you asked that question.
Well, I am too.
And I'm so glad I brought this book. This was sitting on my desk for a lesson that we're going to do next week. So picture books have when I say there's been such a book renaissance of the authors that are getting published it's tremendous. The topics that will get published are it's really hard. It warms your heart. This is a picture book. Now, Milo imagines the world, and we have these great. I use this with 5th graders. It looks very elementary, right? And we talk, and some 5th graders are like, I don't read picture books anymore. I read chapter books. I was like, okay. And we read this. It's by Matt de la Peña. And what the two of them have done is create a very simple picture book, right? It looks like a young child has done it. And Milo is imagining the world, and he's imagining what people he sees on the subway, what their lives look like. And at the end, not to give it away, but he realizes he's been wrong on a lot of his observations. And in fact, the reason he's on the subway is he's going to visit his mother. And his mother is incarcerated. Now, I can't tell you how many children that go through our school district have an incarcerated parent. Maybe some, but I don't think it's a huge amount. But this book, without saying it, right, it doesn't hit you over the head with it, is this beautiful way of love and of maybe making assumptions about people, right, where they're going, what they're doing, why they're doing it. The children sort of were stunned. So then we listened to an interview with Christian Robinson when I did this before, and he talks about the fact that he was raised by a mother who was incarcerated at one point. And he and Matt De La Pena really wanted to tap into this because there are children every day who face really big things. And so if you're going to read this to a younger kid, you're not going to maybe go into great details. You're going to let them sit with it, right, a different way. A fifth grader will be like, wait a minute, we were wrong. And Milo might have been wrong. And it's a very fulfilling conversation when you can take something that's very simplistic, but it might have a deep meaning behind it. I'm forever grateful for these two. They have done multiple projects together, and they've really brought a lot of topics to children to sort of live with, to imagine, but they bring it in such a safe packaging, right, that it's also not scary. Right, it's just a nice, as I say, it's a mirrors and window moment. Right, librarians love to say mirrors and windows. We want you to connect as much as we want you to learn from somebody else's experience. So,
well, you bring up. We only have about a minute and a half left, but you brought up a whole bunch of questions. There were two. I'll see if we can answer them quickly. One was the importance of illustrations.
Yes.
Because you talked about that and how people choose to illustrate, and the other was during the break we were talking about graphic novels and comic books, and you said something about graphic novels that I thought was really important, and I'd like our audience to know.
Graphic novels, it was one of my favorite forms of art, and I really do say art because it is. It's a highly sophisticated process of marrying, the text and the art. I have students who, and as I shared this with you, who are dyslexic. I have students who have different learning disabilities, who have trouble reading. And when they can pick up a graphic novel and read the same thing that another student is reading, it allows them to finally be on par, right? It allows them to bring joy. I always say to parents, don't be afraid of graphic novels. Okay, maybe we don't want to read them all day, every day, right? And we'll add in a chapter book or add in a nonfiction book, add in a magazine. But I, as an adult, like to read them, right? And a good graphic novel is a piece of work, right? It's a masterpiece, and we should lift them up.
Well, yeah, and especially if not only is it for that reason, but it sounds like it has a very therapeutic effect,
Yes.
In terms of somebody's self-confidence. And unfortunately, we're not going to get to the rest of my questions. So, Jen, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on Books in Action.